It is known as the oldest profession in the world. In ancient Mesopotamia and Egypt, there were temples dedicated to sacred prostitution. There are ancient Sumerian records dating back to 2400 BCE that refer to prostitution as an occupation. In this video, we continue our Day in the Life series and travel back to 15th century Germany to see what life was like for one particular prostitute in the exploitative and abusive world inside a medieval brothel. Welcome to Medieval Madness. An evil necessity. In most of Europe, the church was without doubt the most complex establishment in medieval society. It shaped their attitudes and dictated their daily actions at every level. Following the teachings of St. Jerome, quote, "A prostitute was available for the lust of many men." And during the 12th century, Gratian the monk used Jerome's words to define promiscuity as the main feature of determining who was a prostitute. A century later, the Italian Cardinal Hostiensis agreed, and added that there was an element of deceitfulness involved because a whore feigns love and intimacy between herself and her customer. Despite the obvious disgust from the clergy, prostitutes were deemed essential because men were thought to have a natural but sinful sex drive, a need that could corrupt the most respectable of women, even their own wives. If prostitutes were not available as an outlet for men's sexual urges, then they might even turn to that most vile of sins, namely sodomy. So without these ladies of the night, social order would become disturbed and there would be anarchy. Sadly, this meant that these women of the night were not held in high esteem. As they had been in antiquity, they were regarded as a necessary evil and the very worst of sinners. The brothel business. For the medievals, the brothel became the focus for all of that unpleasantness, a sort of outlet for male lust. This meant that many city authorities licensed their bawdy houses, and some were even actually owned by the municipality itself. If bordellos were kept as unobtrusive as possible, then there was no need to abolish prostitution completely. And anyway, as far as the church were concerned, it prevented adultery, masturbation, homosexuality, and rape. It's also important to note that, especially in England, a lot of the clergy were also politicians and businessmen as well as churchmen. In London in particular, several brothels were used to gain revenue for the church, and there was a lot of money to be made from sin. Many bawdy houses were pushed out into the fringes of the city, such as the ones in Bolzano, northern Italy, which were located near to the hangman's home, another person that was ostracized by medieval society. Each house had around a dozen sex workers, and with an annual rent of £70, for the city it was quite a lucrative industry. In an ideal world, working out of a bawdy house rather than walking the streets should have given the women some form of protection. But in reality, some brothel keepers were little better than modern day pimps, and brutalized the females in their care. Most of them had been sold to the keeper in the first place, usually by their own families. Lease agreements between brothel keepers and the governing authority were set out. Keepers had to swear oaths of loyalty and obedience. There were also rules that forbade drunkenness and blasphemy in the brothel itself, and policies to govern the relationship between a prostitute and her procurer. For example, in some cities such as Vienna, rules meant that keepers had to be female. Sexploitation. Els von Eystett started working at the municipal brothel in Nordlingen, Germany, late in the 15th century. She was initially employed as a kitchen maid, and it's thought that she was probably forced into selling her body for money by the brothel keeper Leinhard Freiermuth and his partner Barbara Taschenfeiden. Els became pregnant by one of her clients. When Barbara found out, she mixed together a potion of periwinkle, wild carrot, cloves, and wine in order to induce an abortion. Then she forced Els to drink the concoction. Els did indeed miscarry and lost a male fetus who was said to have been about 20 weeks old. Given no time to recover from her ordeal, Els was forced to go back to work immediately and told that she would be beaten if she told anyone about the abortion. However, Barbel von Esslingen, a fellow prostitute, witnessed the child's body laid out on a bench in Els' room. She had taken a pail of water to her friend, who was lying on her bed in agony. Barbel began to speak about what she had seen to the other women, so she was sent away by Leinhard and Barbara to another brothel in Ulm. But it was too late. The clients at the brothel also became suspicious when they realized that Els, quote, who had been big, was now small. When the council heard the gossip, they decided to send 2 officials to visit the brothel. They told the brothel keeper and his partner that talk had reached senior council members and an investigation would soon begin. As soon as the men had left, Leinhardt, infuriated, rushed to where Els and the other women were eating and gave Els a severe beating. But refusing to be cowed, bravely she screamed back at Leinhardt that he would have to chop off her arms and legs to keep her from testifying against him. Later, Leinhardt and Barbara realized that the game was up, so they decided to try and reach an arrangement with Els. If she agreed to keep quiet, they would wipe her debt and she could leave the brothel quietly the next day. Els accepted, and as agreed, when it came time to leave, Barbara smuggled her out quietly. Then she made a show of asking the other women where Els had gone and pretended to search the brothel for her. But Els had already told another prostitute named Margaret von Beibrach all about the plan. The investigation. And so the examination began. The first part was all about the alleged abortion. For the medievals, once a fetus resembled an actual human being, it was thought to have acquired a soul. So abortion at such a late stage in a pregnancy was considered a serious offence. Els was never under any suspicion of aborting her baby. She testified in the town of Weissenberg, where she had gone when she left her brothel in Nordlingen. 2 witnesses, Margaret and Anna von Ulm, corroborated her evidence and told how Els wept inconsolably for the loss of her baby, saying that Barbara had, quote, taken her child from her and killed her flesh and blood. The second part of the investigation was more of a general inquiry concerning the working conditions in the public brothel, and whether Leinhardt, the brothel keeper, had broken the oath that he took when he started the job in 1469. Now nearly all of the women came forward to speak about their cruel treatment. The investigation uncovered that many of them were beaten by Leinhardt if they tried to refuse a customer, sometimes with a rod or belt and other times with a bullwhip. On arrival at the bordello, Anna claimed that all the women had their clothing confiscated, meaning that she had to, quote, go about miserably and almost naked. Els agreed, saying she had to pay to get her own skirt back. The women were kept in debt right from the outset. They had to pay for their room and food, such as it was, and also give 1/3 of their earnings. They were forced to have sex even when they were menstruating, which they referred to as having their womanly sickness, and on holy days, which was illegal according to the terms of city's contract. Another legal requirement was that the women had to be given extra food when they were menstruating. This was not adhered to. In fact, they were fed disgusting slop on a daily basis. They were charged exorbitant prices for their meal and wine, in fact anything that they needed, meaning that they were in everlasting debt. Leinhardt charged clients a fee called sleeping money if they wanted to stay overnight. One of the women described how, when a client failed to turn up, she was forced to pay the fee herself. They were also denied permission to hear mass, which was the right of every citizen. It was true that once a woman found herself in that line of work, it was practically impossible to get out unless she was carried out in a coffin, and that usually occurred through malnutrition, exhaustion, or disease, especially sexually transmitted diseases. The foreign disease. What we now call syphilis, no one wanted to take responsibility for during the Middle Ages. The French called it the Neapolitan disease. In England, Italy, and Germany, it was the French disease. Russia said it was the Polish, and the Turks said it was because of the Christians. But inevitably, the church blamed women, because all the evils in the world could be traced back to Eve's transgression in the Garden of Eden, the original sin. For the medievals, just discussing the act of sex was taboo, and STDs were thought of as a punishment for anyone not living within the teachings of the church. Their answer to the problem was to encourage abstinence as a way of life, which, even in the highly religious Middle Ages, was just never going to work. Really, STDs like prostitution have been around since the start of human civilization. There is a lot of evidence of venereal disease in ancient society. Clay tablets from Mesopotamia display erotic images of genitalia with signs of infection, as do Egyptian papyri from 1550 BCE. Syphilis was one of the most widespread venereal diseases of the Middle Ages, and was mostly spread through brothels and prostitutes, as many carriers showed no symptoms. At any point about a month after contact, the disease presents itself with lesions on the body. But they are usually quite painless, which is why people think they are harmless. Later, these skin sores often spread to the palms of the hand and the soles of the feet, as well as the mouth, vagina, and anus. The list of other symptoms is extensive as the disease progresses and includes fever, swollen lymph nodes, hair loss, weight loss, headaches, and general fatigue. Hit it with a hammer. Without treatment, syphilis can penetrate the nervous system and cause blindness, paralysis, dementia, and eventually death. Children born with congenital syphilis that is passed on during pregnancy or childbirth can suffer from facial disfigurement and enlargement of the spleen and liver. Medieval physicians, who didn't know any better, prescribed poisonous mercury to be rubbed on the sores, allowing the chemical to enter the bloodstream and make a sick person much sicker. Leeches might be used as they were thought to suck out the disease. Some doctors also recommended that men hit themselves in the genitals with something heavy. Needless to say, none of these so-called cures work, and the last one probably just hurt a lot. Gonorrhea was another disease with a high infection rate. However, it was very rarely fatal, just very unpleasant. Medievals called it the burning sickness because of the pain it caused when urinating. It was suggested that these areas should be cleaned with urine and vinegar as purification. Not only didn't this work, it was probably also incredibly stinky. Unseen. Both Lionheart and Barbara were barred from ever entering the city again. Barbara was also branded across the forehead because she was responsible for the abortion of Els von Eystett's child. The prostitutes of Nordlingen were kept in horrific conditions, but it would seem that violence and mistreatment were common in most medieval brothels throughout Europe, and it was only the action of a forced abortion that brought the abuse to light. Elle's story is important because it highlights the history of sex workers, a group of people who have been for the most part overlooked, but have always been an important part of society from time immemorial. Nothing is known of the women from Nordlingen brothel after the investigation in 1472, but we now know that they were unique, complex, and their lives mattered. Thank you for watching this episode of Medieval Madness. Please do subscribe if you're enjoying these videos, as we do release a new one every Friday. Hope everyone has an awesome week. Cheers!